Okay, good morning, everyone. So, overview. What privileges did the small group of whites enjoy? Why did some of the enslaved enjoy more privileges than others? Why did whites and enslaved Africans fear each other? The plantocracy, housing and lands were more advanced than the enslaved. The whites lived in well-built great houses that were decorated with stylish architectural features or townhouses made of bricks. They were usually built by their own slaves. Their lands were always the best. They were the biggest and they were the biggest and most fertile soil of all the other lands. This would also contribute to the wealth of the whites too. Meanwhile, the enslaved housing consists of wooden shacks with dirt floors. They had no bedsteads and other required furniture. Their beds were collections of straws, and the frames made of scraps of unused boards. As mentioned, the whites lived a very comfortable and easy life because they could order the types of homes and lands they wanted to their liking. They were provided with the best of the best furniture, including proper beddings and sturdy bed frames. They lived more like royals and nobles because they took advantage of their slaves' ability and strength. Therefore, we can safely say that whites were given better shelters, cozier decor, and useful lands. The plantocracy partake in the finest feast. Whites had better soils to plant their crops on, so they would harvest better fruits and vegetables to feed themselves and their families. They earned a great amount of wealth, so they imported various crops and food items from other countries, such as curry from India and various types of cheeses from other European countries. They used their slaves to plow and gather their crops for them. They also had cooks who had different styles of cooking, which gave them a vast experience of different cultures. They always were served first, received the greater rations of food, and given the best wines and pastries. While the Africans mainly fed on starchy and fatty foods such as yam and green bananas, which affected their health at times. Therefore, whites fed well compared to the enslaved. Whites wore quality clothing items. Whites could afford to purchase their wives fancy petticoats, delicate mittens, embroidered coats, jeweled hair clips, diamond or pearl rings, corsets, dainty umbrellas, and lace socks, while men wore their fancy vests, quality leather belts and shoes, fedora hats, and accessorized with even a gold tooth. Many whites wore many whites wore more jewelry or colors based on their wealth. For example, purple, gold, green, and red indicated you were of royal or noble lineage, while the enslaved wore clothing sewn together from various scraps of materials. They may roam barefooted, or wear fragile boots or sandals. Women's hair were usually cut by the planters' wives to make them less attractive and tie their hairs in turbans or any scarf. Whites had the privilege of wearing finer clothing items than slaves. Why did some enslaved enjoy more privilege than others? The lighter your skin, the easier life will be, especially as a woman. Light skinned or mixed women were given better jobs and other opportunities, such as nurses, mistresses, concubines, seamstresses, shopkeepers, domestics, or even prostitutes. Though some of these jobs still didn't seem to be the majority's choice in today's society, being a prostitute then was more of a privilege than working in the hot sun. Light-skinned and mixed women were valued due to their beauty or even their links to a white person such as their father or mother. This would encourage a start of women versus women, cause these women might have feel as though they were the creme de la creme of the group. There was a very evident form of discrimination amongst colored women. The enslaved working in the planters' homes would also receive more privileges. The domestic workers didn't have to work constantly in the boiling sun for hours a day. They were sheltered and given less burdensome labor. They usually stayed in great houses such as Rose Hall Great House. Planters would give the domestic workers jobs such as nursing their wives' babies, cooking, run errands, maintaining the household cleanliness, sewing clothes, or even having children for the white owner. Many of these workers would live an easier life due to the fact that some may win the favor of their masters and receive more opportunities to be freed slaves or become their masters' wives. These these workers were like butlers and maids, and they were required to be on their masters in their master's reach at all times. Although they had to work hard, it wasn't anything compared to the field workers. In-house workers enjoy the luxuries of having not to work tirelessly in the heat and bushes all day. They also had a better chance of being favored by their masters. Freed Africans did not require to follow the strict orders of the plantocracy. Enslaved who brought their freedom, manumission, or mulattoes were given the chance to live their lives freely, even though they were still looked down upon by the whites. They were ranked below the poor whites but above the artisans and jobbing slaves. This group of people were able to buy properties and other goods if any were available. Freed enslaved lived somewhat of a normal life compared to the slaves working on the plantations. There were different ways a person could earn their freedom. They would have to purchase it by using their wages from being jobbing slaves or drivers. Or they were offsprings of whites who didn't want their child to suffer harsh conditions. Freed workers were given a good amount of civil treatment than other Africans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Denton, you're the only one who did the work, or both you and Edwards put together and contributed?
Sarah both did it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good attempt at healing. One slight comment I didn't, but it is your view on it, so I wouldn't touch on it. All right. McLeish and Norman.
Sir, I work with Morrison.
Sorry. McLeish and Morgan. McLeish and Morgan.
Sir?
Go ahead for me.
Sir, it wasn't completed because Gabrielle, she said that she had been having trouble with her Wi-Fi in her community.
So you haven't do any of the work?
Sir, I did A and B.
Then present on the A and B. Present on it.
Sir, I have it written in my book.
Then present on it.
Sir, I forgot to read the last part.
Repeat.
Sir, I forgot to read the last part. Sir, that's what you were saying. I forgot last part.
No, Denton. I realized that you went over it, but that's okay.
Okay.
That's okay. McLeish, read it.
Yes, sir.
Go on,
Sir?
read what you have.
Okay, A, what privilege did the small group of whites at the top enjoy? The whites, also called the plantocracy, had more privileges than the enslaved. There was a segregation between the whites and blacks, and the whites believed they were better than the blacks, so the blacks didn't have access to many of the luxurious things the whites have. The whites ate better food, their housing was superior, they owned the wealth of the island, slaves, and land. They also wore better clothing and were educated and had social influence. The blacks weren't as educated as the whites because they were not allowed at any of the institutions. The whites also had high positions in the militia. The whites lived luxurious lives compared to the blacks. Or B, why did some enslaved on a typical Caribbean plantation enjoy more privileges than others? Some enslaved enjoyed more privileges than others. For example, the mulattoes acquired their freedom either by manumission or as a grant from their masters. That was so because the white male masters had children with some of the enslaved women, and they wouldn't want their children to be suffering like the others. They were lighter complexion, they were born Creole in the Caribbean, and were seen to have had a greater degree of acculturation into white culture, loyalty, and submissiveness. The mulattoes appeared to be fortunate than other enslaved.
All right. Thank you very much. Same issue with the other group. I think that it needs to be peeled a little more, but you have the content. The content is there, but to get the full 9 marks, you can't write just that alone to get the 9 marks. All right, so develop those points, because what you did was to put all the points together in just one paragraph. You have to separate your points and develop each of them. But good attempt thus far. Morrison and Norman.
This is the assignment that Janelle Norman and Ariana Morrison, did.
Go ahead.
On a typical Caribbean plantation, there were two main groups. At the top, there was a small group of whites who enjoyed many privileges. At the bottom was a large group of enslaved, some of whom enjoyed more privileges than others. There were divisions among enslaved. Whites and enslaved favored each other. What privileges did the small group of whites that are at the top of the hierarchy enjoyed over all the others? Point: the Europeans ate the best food. Evidence: Europeans in the days of slavery in the Caribbean was seen as superior, and that comes with eating the best food. They would eat the best crops the slaves would plant for them, and some were wealthy enough to import and sell these foods. Wait, Jenny, you go back, please. Europeans were more accustomed to the explanation. Europeans were more accustomed to European food, therefore they would import it until they would grow and rear different plants and animals from Europe. When when these Europeans' food would be grown and reared in the Caribbean, they would eat it with other foods they liked from the Western world. The foods they didn't like were considered lower class or slave food. Slaves would also get. Sir, can you hear me? Because there's a truck outside.
Yeah, man, I'm hearing you. We're not hearing it.
Oh, the food they didn't like were considered lower class or slave food. Slaves would also get the leftover food and crops to eat after the slave owners were done collecting the crops for exportation and self nourishment. Examples of slave food were okra, black eyed peas, saltfish ackee, mangoes, kidney beans, rice, papaya, yams, guavas, and cassava. Link, therefore, Europeans ate the best food.
All right, remain on that. Go back to the other slide for me about best food. All right, go ahead for me. Good, good.
Point: the Europeans' housing was better. Evidence: the Europeans lived in great houses, while the slaves would live in slave villages, which was unsanitary small places that people were not suitable to live in. Explanation: some of the Europeans in the Caribbean would be living in great houses with a strong foundation that was constantly cleaned by domestic slaves. While some Europeans couldn't afford slaves and great houses, but their houses were still suitable to live in. On the other hand, the Africans lived in slave villages. Their housing was small and their house foundation was poor. The Africans couldn't afford better housing because they were paid little or nothing, and they were able to get better jobs by law. Link, therefore, Europeans' housing was better. Next one, Janine. The Europeans' jobs were less physically demanding. The evidence is the Europeans had jobs like governors, governmental officials, merchants, planters, overseers, medical doctors, attorneys, and bookkeepers, while most Africans in the Caribbean were slaves. The everyday life of a slave consisted of getting up early in the morning, working hard in your designated area on the plantation for long hard hours in the Caribbean heat, and then go and then going home late at night, and they would do this every day to get paid very little or probably nothing. The work the Europeans would have to do is nothing compared to what the slaves had to go to on a day to day basis. Explanation: by law, the Africans weren't allowed to have any other occupation other than slavery. Therefore, they could only be slaves by force. Even if they were, they could. e- Even if they were, they weren't. They wouldn't be allowed to attend schools that offer good education. For example, Jamaica College and Wilmos were schools made for only white students. They weren't able to access good education, therefore they wouldn't be qualified for any jobs, and they would be forced into slavery. Link, therefore the Europeans' jobs were less physically demanding. Next one, Janiel.
And then also you could mention the types of different jobs, because I understand the point that you're making there, but what were the different jobs that were not demanding on the plantation? You could list those jobs in your, like, overseer, the bookkeeper. Those were jobs that, and some were attorneys, uh, governors, attorneys. Yes. All right. So you could have
The
listed
Europeans'
them.
jobs, sir?
Yeah.
I did list those.
Go back to the PowerPoint.
Sir, for the evidence, I had the Europeans had jobs like governors, government officials, merchant, planters, overseers, medical doctors, attorney, and bookkeepers.
All right. Sorry about that. I didn't hear. Go to the next one. Sorry about that.
Yes, sir. Why did some enslaved on a typical Caribbean plantation enjoy more privileges than others? Point: in the Caribbean, some of. Oh, wait, Janelle, you're supposed to be reading this?
Ariane, I can read from me. I'm sharing the slide. It's kind of
Oh, I didn't know
difficult.
you did it. You weren't able to. Sorry.
Janelle, are you using a phone?
Mm, Tablet.
A tablet? Okay. Because sometimes it's breaking up from my end.
Point: in the Caribbean, some of the enslaved had more privileges than others on the plantation because of the social structure and their loyalty and submissiveness. Evidence: mulattoes had their freedom because of their lighter complexion. Usually, their fathers were white, and only whites could control and make decisions and manumission. Explain: the enslaved had lighter complexion, or mulattoes are often placed in great houses, and domestic slaves which offer less work physically than a field slave. Link: in the Caribbean, the enslaved had privileges because of their devotion to whites and complexion and ages. Social rank points, social rank slash structure. Evidence: some of the enslaved had skills that benefit the Europeans. The Europeans obtained wealth from countries, and they rewarded the enslaved from difficult duties. Explanation. The field slaves were divided into three gangs: the first gang, second gang, and third gang, otherwise known as the picnic gang. The second gang and third gang consisted of children, pregnant women, and the elderly. These gangs shared their privilege because of their ages and conditions, having less work physically than the first group. Link. The Caribbean in the enslaved had privileges because of their devotion to white and complexion and ages. Point, loyalty, and submissiveness. Evidence. In the Caribbean, the enslaved gained their trust because of their loyalty towards white, and the whites eventually gave them duties to inform the slaves about activities on the plantation. Due to the slaves' submissiveness to their master, it shows that they respect the whites and they respect the whites. The whites gave them privileges because of their value and hard work contributed to the economic stability of American products. Link. In the Caribbean, the enslaved had privileges because of their devotion to whites, complexion, and ages. Why did the whites and enslaved on a typical Caribbean plantation fear each other? Point. The whites and enslaved feared one another in the Caribbean because of dominance, population, and differences in culture. Evidence. The Africans were a larger population than whites because of the shortage of labor in the Americas, and whites feared that they might rebel. Explain. The Africans were used for a labor force, so they kidnapped millions from Africa to the Americas. The whites were less than the enslaved and made laws to control the enslaved Africans. Link. Therefore, in the Caribbean, the whites and enslaved feared one another. Point. The whites and enslaved feared one another in the Caribbean because of their dominance, population, and differences in culture. The evidence. The whites were at the top of the social structure. They had so much dominance over the enslaved that they could separate families, pass laws, and be elected into political office. Explain. The whites were far more superior because of their weapons and social ranking. They were allowed to be educated except blacks. Whites had the opportunity to be educated, therefore they will get more opportunities and get a good job and become wealthy. The enslaved remained in poverty because schools were only allowed whites. The whites could separate families, pass laws, and be elected into political office. Link. Therefore, in the Caribbean, the whites and enslaved fear each other. Point. The whites and enslaved feared one another because of dominance, population, and differences in culture. Evidence. Both races had different cultures. The enslaved Africans feared that the whites would ridicule their culture, and whites feared that the practices used such as obeah because it could harm them. Explains. Since the Europeans kidnapped millions of Americans and brought them to the Caribbean to work on plantations, the African culture was still alive and celebrated amongst the slaves. Both races were in fear because of the acceptance and the differences in races. The enslaved Africans feared for ridicule in their culture, and the whites feared for their lives because it could harm them. Among the African culture is music, dance, language, and religious practices such as obeah. Link. Therefore, the Caribbean and the Caribbean, therefore in the Caribbean, the whites and enslaved feared each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. I want everybody to note from this presentation how the peel was done. and also that they had their 3 points, and those points were, each of the points were peeled. And that is something that I'm asking every single student to do when you are doing your peeling. So don't peel everything together in just one paragraph. That's not peeling, right? So what you need to do is to just summarize, not what you need to do is to put, if it is a 9 marks question, you need to peel 3 paragraphs or 3 points, which would give you 3 paragraphs. And that will enable you to maximize on the marks in the exam. All right, I remember that history is a writing subject. So then, thank you very much, Morrison and Norman, Robinson and Sawyers.
Question A. What privilege did the small group of whites at the top enjoy? Privilege 1, the whites enjoyed a lot of political rights and privileges. Privilege 2, the whites enjoyed better living conditions. Privilege 3, the whites enjoyed better educational privileges. The whites enjoyed many privileges as a result of being at the top of the social hierarchy. One of these privileges was a lot of political rights. The whites, rich whites to be more specific, were the only group of people in the Caribbean that could be elected into offices / positions of power. This means that they were the ones that made the laws in which everyone obeyed. These rich whites were a part of the plantocracy. The plantocracy consisted of governors, government officials, plantation owners and overseers, plantation managers and supervisors. The poor whites, such as clerks and bookkeepers, were not eligible for positions of power, but they did have the privilege of voting along with the members of the plantocracy. These privileges benefited the whites tremendously. It was another way that they could keep the enslaved people under control because only they had the right to vote. They could put laws in place that further obstructed the process of the enslaved people and ensured dominance, comfort, and happiness for themselves. Therefore, political rights was one of the many privileges enjoyed by the whites. Another privilege that the whites enjoyed was better living conditions. Since they were at the top of the social hierarchy, it was only right that they ensured they got the best of everything. They enjoyed better quality clothing. For example, the slave masters and overseers' clothes were often made of wool, a more comfortable material than cotton, which was what the clothes of the enslaved people were made of. They even had a great number of clothes. The whites were able to wear different clothes each day or whenever they wanted. They had a wide variety of food to eat, which was deliciously prepared by their domestic servants. They also enjoyed better housing as the great house was bigger and more comfortable than any other house on the property, and it was filled with furniture. Their jobs were also less demanding than that of the enslaved, and so they had a lot of leisure time on their hands. Majority of their privileges are seen through the ways the white slave. The clothes that the enslaved people wore were nothing in comparison to that of the whites. The enslaved people also had
limited clothing. Some, mainly children, even had to work naked. Enslaved were often limited food items and had to grow their own in order to not eat the same thing all the time. Their quarters were also not as comfortable or filled with as much furniture as that of the Great House. Therefore, whites had a major privilege when it came to living conditions. In addition to the previously stated privileges, whites also enjoyed better education than that of the enslaved. The whites received quality education in Europe and ensured that their children got quality education as well. They developed schools in the Caribbean, such as the Wilmer School and the Jamaica College. Here, they taught whites the skills they would need to become successful businessmen, lawyers, etc. Blacks were not allowed at these institutions during slavery. The slave owners saw literacy in Blacks as a threat to their institutions and financial investments, and thus thought it was unwise to teach the enslaved anything that would help them to acquire skills that would make them better and smarter. Due to this, the enslaved people did not have the same education as the whites. This did not mean that they weren't skilled, but academically, they could have been much more. The enslaved children were mostly taught how to do their work on the plantation and about their culture from the elders, not how to read and write and calculate. Therefore, education was another major privilege that the whites enjoyed over the enslaved people. Question B. Why did some enslaved on a typical Caribbean plantation enjoy more privileges than others? Reason 1, race and color of skin. Reason 2, skills. Reason 3, wealth. On a typical Caribbean plantation, the enslaved got to enjoy different privileges based off their race, color, gender, wealth, and skills. It was quite obvious that the mulattoes or people of Caucasian descent sat at the top of the hierarchical chart and received privileges such as better food, housing, and less strenuous tasks to complete like domestic work, and were even granted their freedom. This was because they were seen as superior because of their lighter complexion and were notorious for having a greater degree of submissiveness and loyalty to the white culture. Some of the mulattoes were even direct family members, such as daughters and sons of white people or slave masters. They even tended to mimic the slave masters in treatment of Black people. Thus, your race and skin was a very important privilege to have on a plantation and somewhat created a racial divide among workers on the plantations. The enslaved also received and enjoyed different privileges amongst each other based off their skills and often determined how he or she was treated. Whether you were Black, white, or mulatto, the skills in which the enslaved possessed aided in the privileges in which they received. Workers such as carpenters, merchants, metal workers, and masons received privileges such as better clothing, more free time for themselves, and in rare circumstances, even a small plot of land to cultivate their own food on. This was because they were very important in the upkeeping of factories, buildings, equipment, and transportation. Sometimes they were even responsible for coordinating major tasks like supervising the transportation of sugar to and from the plantation during the harvest time. They were also very rare and in short supply, so the planters decided to give them better treatment so it would encourage them to stay and work instead of fleeing. Therefore, having a skill was very important in determining what privileges the enslaved received on the plantations. Wealth plays a huge part in slave society as well as in our modern day society. How much money a slave had often determined his or her privileges as well. Not all slaves during the 19th and 20th century were completely broke, enslaved, and overworked. The free Blacks in the society often gained their freedom by simply purchasing it from their enslavers. This is called manumission, or they were freed a grant from the slaveholder when they passed. Slaves such as Olado Equiano was able to buy his freedom in 1766 from his master. Manumission is possible when a slave accumulates enough money to buy his own freedom. They gain this money by selling to other plantations, barter, extra labor, or from selling out other slaves, therefore highlighting why wealth was a very important asset to the enslaved. Question C, why did whites and enslaved on a typical Caribbean plantation fear each other? Reason one, the whites feared the enslaved because they were smaller in number. Reason two, the whites deliberately instilled fear into the enslaved people. Reason three, the whites feared the religion of the enslaved people, One of the reasons the whites feared the enslaved was because the whites were smaller in number. With the importing and breeding of enslaved people, the numbers just kept rising and rising, faster than that of the rate of white reproduction and the white Europeans traveling to the Caribbean. Some plantation owners did not even migrate to the Caribbean to tend to their plantations. They would instead send representatives while they stayed in Europe and reaped the benefits. These were the absentee planters. The population of Blacks got so large that the ratio of Blacks to whites was as large as 25-1. By the mid-18th century, where one white man was assigned to 25 Black enslaved, in the Nevis, 1774, there were 10,000 Blacks in the country compared to 1,000 whites, and in Antigua of the same year, there were 37,808 Blacks in the country compared to 2,590 whites. The whites knew that they were outnumbered by the Blacks and were afraid of an uprising/attack because they knew there was a possibility that the enslaved could prevail. They were also afraid of the possibility of the enslaved poisoning them or destroying their machines, which will then cost them either their lives or a lot of money. Because of these, their treatment of the Blacks worsened as they strived to keep dominance over them. Therefore, the whites feared the Blacks because their population was smaller in number. The enslaved feared the whites because they purposefully instilled fear into them. The whites had superior weapons, for example, guns. These guns were in the hands of the backing army of militia that they had, a militia that was trained to keep the Blacks in check. Because of this, the enslaved would be too afraid to challenge the whites despite being larger in number. Fear would also be instilled by beatings and lynching. The whites would sadistically beat and lynch Black people in front of one another, which would cause the other Blacks to fear this ever happening to them and thus behave docilely. The enslaved would also fear the whites, taking their children away from them. The whites would often sell the children of Blacks to the neighboring plantations as punishment, and so in order to not lose their children, they would remain docile. The whites were also in control of the law. Therefore, they made laws the way they saw fit and laws that kept the enslaved in line. Since the whites knew what a threat the enslaved were, they had to put in these measures to scare them. The enslaved are not weak people, and the whites knew they were not to be underestimated. Future rebellions would prove this to be true. With these measures came a lot of enslaved following in line and being docile. They wouldn't try to escape, mess up the machines, and would even sell their own in order to keep the whites off their backs and get into good graces. Therefore, the whites made the Blacks fear them by scaring them into submission. The whites also feared the religions and practices of the enslaved people because they didn't understand them, while the enslaved people feared ridiculing of their religion. The enslaved people were from different parts of West Africa, and thus some of them had different religious practices from each other. They did, however, find middle ground, and their practices ended up being a mixture of what they all believed in. They believed in life after death, the spirit world, in which they made up many superstitious stories, ancestral spirits, gods of nature, and they also had the highest respect for Mother Earth. Some of them also practiced magic such as Obeah and Mayalism, both of which involved herbs, oils, potions, etc. They conducted their worship at night and did so in the form of music and dance. This was something the enslaved people looked forward to and took much pride in. The whites were Christians, and so they didn't understand or respect the religion that the enslaved people practiced. The fact that the enslaved worship in African Creole made it even more difficult to understand, and so the practices were not to be done in the presence of the whites. The whites believed that the enslaved people would use their magic practices to cast spells on them and cause them harm, and so they would not permit the enslaved people to practice their religion around them. The enslaved people loved their religion and feared any form of chastisement or ridicule, which is why they did their worshiping in secret, because they feared the whites would do something to stop them from practicing their religion. Therefore, the whites feared the religion of the enslaved, and enslaved feared ridiculing, which caused them to worship in secret.
Ladies, excellent presentation, excellent peeling. I think you also did a similar peeling for the last assignment. And I'm very pleased with that you understand the peeling approach, right? How to peel. So the presentations were very good this morning. We have 2 more presentations for tomorrow. So tomorrow morning, we're going to do 2 presentations to finish the presentations. And then after that, I will go through the question. All right. So thank you very much, ladies. And thank you very much for doing the assignment. Go ahead for me.
Hemmings is here.
All right. Emmons, all right. Thank you very much.
Sir James is here also.
Where is James? Okay. Groves is here?
Who, sir?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And Edwards is here?
Yes, sir.